Q.48 Who says organization, says oligarchy. Who said this and why? Introduction, context of the statement. The famous statement, who says organization, says oligarchy, was made by Robert Michels, 1876 to 1936, a German sociologist and political theorist. It appears in his seminal work, Political Parties, 1911, where he formulated what is known as the iron law of oligarchy. Through this law, Michels argued that all organizations, whether democratic or autocratic, inevitably develop oligarchic tendencies, meaning that power becomes concentrated in the hands of a few leaders. This observation was based on Michels' empirical study of political parties, especially socialist and democratic ones, where despite their egalitarian ideals, power gradually shifted from the masses to a small elite leadership. Meaning of the statement: when Michels said, "Who says organization, says oligarchy," he meant that the very process of organizing people into structured groups, political parties, trade unions, or associations, naturally leads to the formation of a ruling minority within that organization. In other words, the existence of an organization itself implies the emergence of a small group of leaders who make decisions, control communication, and dominate the membership. Hence, organization and oligarchy are inseparable. Wherever there is organization, there is concentration of power. Explanation: the iron law of oligarchy. The iron law of oligarchy is Michels' sociological law explaining why democracy in large organizations tends to degenerate into oligarchy. He called it iron because this process is inevitable and universal. It operates regardless of the organization's ideology, structure, or size. Michels observed that even in socialist and workers' parties, founded on democratic principles, leaders eventually became dominant and unaccountable, while ordinary members became passive followers. Thus, he concluded that organization breeds bureaucracy, and bureaucracy leads to the rule of a few over the many. Reasons why organization leads to oligarchy. Michels identified several structural and psychological reasons for this tendency. 1. Necessity of leadership. Every organization, especially large ones, requires leaders to coordinate activities, make decisions, and represent the group. This practical necessity creates a division between leaders and the led. Over time, leaders accumulate experience, skill, and authority, giving them dominance over the ordinary members. Example: in a political party, leaders who manage campaigns and negotiations gain more influence than the rank-and-file members. 2. Technical and administrative expertise. Leadership requires specialized knowledge, oratory, and organizational ability, which most members lack. Because of this, leaders become indispensable, and members rely on them for decisions, reinforcing their power and permanence. Example: professional politicians and administrators develop technical skills that make them difficult to replace, consolidating oligarchic control. 3. Control over organizational machinery. Leaders control key instruments of power, such as funds, communication channels, and membership records. This gives them the ability to influence elections, frame agendas, and suppress opposition, thereby perpetuating their authority. 4. Psychological dependence of the masses. Ordinary members often admire, trust, or even fear their leaders. This psychological dependence discourages dissent and fosters obedience. Michels called this the apathy of the masses. People prefer to follow rather than participate actively in decision-making. 5. Institutionalization of leadership. Over time, leadership positions become institutionalized with formal titles, privileges, and salaries. This separates leaders from the rank and file and gives rise to a self-perpetuating ruling class within the organization. 6. Self-interest of leaders. Once in power, leaders develop a vested interest in maintaining their positions. They prioritize organizational stability and personal advantage over democratic ideals, discouraging internal challenges. Thus, even in democratic parties, leaders resist change that could threaten their authority, reproducing oligarchic tendencies. Illustrative example, Socialist Party's Michels based his theory on the study of the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, a party that professed democracy and equality. He found that its leadership became bureaucratic, hierarchical, and conservative, preferring to maintain control rather than empower the working class. Despite socialist ideals, the leadership concentrated decision-making power, turning a mass party into a bureaucratic elite, proving Michels' statement. Broader implications of Michels' theory. 1. Universal tendency. According to Michels, the iron law applies to all organizations, political, social, religious, or economic. Even democratic systems, he argued, cannot escape the dominance of elites. Example. In modern democracies, small groups of political leaders, bureaucrats, and business elites, what C. Wright Mills later called the power elite, dominate decision-making. 2. Transformation of democracy into leadership rule. Democracy requires participation, but organization requires efficiency. Efficiency demands leadership, and leadership creates hierarchy, thus. Democracy naturally evolves into oligarchy. Michels famously stated, "It is organization which gives birth to the dominion of the elected over the electors, of the mandataries over the mandators, of the delegates over the delegators. Who says organization, says oligarchy." 3. Pessimistic view of democracy. Michels' conclusion was deeply pessimistic. He argued that true democracy is impossible in large organizations because leaders will always dominate the masses. Even when leaders claim to represent the people, they inevitably pursue their own interests, ensuring the persistence of oligarchy. Criticisms of Michels' theory. Although influential, the iron law of oligarchy has been criticized on several grounds. 1. Overgeneralization. Not all organizations inevitably become oligarchic. Some maintain participatory structures, especially with checks and internal democracy. 2. Neglect of institutional reforms. Modern democracies use constitutional mechanisms like term limits, transparency laws, and decentralization to prevent concentration of power. 3. Dynamic leadership. Leadership does not always corrupt. Responsible leaders can remain accountable and democratic through ethical and institutional discipline. 4. Historical counterexamples. Movements like the Indian independence struggle or participatory grassroots organizations show that leadership can coexist with mass involvement. Summary for quick understanding: the statement, "Who says organization, says oligarchy," was made by Robert Michels in his book Political Parties, 1911. It expresses his iron law of oligarchy, which claims that all organizations, regardless of their democratic ideals, inevitably become dominated by a small elite group of leaders. This happens due to the necessity of leadership, technical expertise, control over resources, and mass passivity. Michel's view is both a warning and a paradox, that democracy requires organization, yet organization naturally breeds oligarchy. Quick revision notes. Thinker Robert Michel's work, Political Parties, 1911. Law, Iron Law of Oligarchy. Key idea: every organization tends to become oligarchic. Reason: leadership necessity, technical expertise, control of resources, mass apathy. Example: German Social Democratic Party. Implication: democracy, organization, bureaucracy, oligarchy. Criticism: too deterministic, ignores reforms and accountability mechanisms. One-line questions and answers for revision. 1. Who said? Who says organization, says oligarchy? Robert Michel's. 2. In which work did Michel's present this idea? Political Parties, 1911. 3. What is the theory called? The Iron Law of Oligarchy. 4. What does the statement mean? Every organization naturally leads to the rule of a few leaders. 5. What kind of tendency does organization create? Oligarchic or hierarchical tendency. 6. What was Michel's main empirical study? The German Social Democratic Party, SPD. 7. What are the causes of oligarchy? Leadership necessity, expertise, control, and mass apathy. 8. What is the relationship between democracy and oligarchy according to Michel's? Democracy inevitably turns into oligarchy. 9. Why is the law called iron? Because Michel's saw it as universal and inescapable. 10. What is a key criticism of Michel's theory? It ignores the possibility of internal democracy and accountability reforms. Final connection. Robert Michel's maxim, who says organization, says oligarchy, captures a profound truth about human institutions, that power tends to concentrate, even in systems built on equality. His iron law of oligarchy remains a cautionary insight for all democracies, reminding us that eternal vigilance, transparency, and participation are the only ways to keep leadership accountable and prevent democracy from decaying into rule by the few.